listener production.
Hey there, I'm Bension Siebert, and this is your Wednesday afternoon briefing. Do you ever check your email after work? Have you ever taken a work phone call or a Teams message while you're at the gym or you're eating dinner or really should be watching Netflix? It's the first week of federal parliament for the year, and the government is looking at giving you the right to disconnect. That means to switch off all your devices if you want to and refuse to engage in any work outside of your working hours. It sounds great, but this is in no way simple. Would this undermine our professional ambitions? And what would it mean for those of us working flexible hours, especially since COVID? On the other hand, research from the left-leaning think tank the Australia Institute from a couple of years ago claims that Australians are losing $93 billion a year in unpaid overtime. That means working around 6 full weeks on average for free, and that's on average. Well, Natalie Gaspar is an employment lawyer and partner at Herbert Smith Freehills, and she joins us to explain how a right to disconnect would actually work. Natalie, under the current law, if your boss calls you at 10 p.m, do you have the right not to take that phone call?
Well, look, as it stands today, there's a suite of laws in Australia that have protections for employees for working additional hours. I wouldn't say it's as high as a right to not take that call, but there are existing protections to not work overtime hours that are not reasonable. Any hours in addition to 38 worked each week needs to be reasonable, and there's a whole suite of laws across the country which are designed to protect workers' health, particularly their psychosocial health, with a great emphasis on that in recent years and months.
So the reason that we're talking about this today is that the government is considering a recommended change to employment law where workers would have the right to disconnect. What does that actually mean?
Australia's not the first to consider this. It is an existing right in many countries in the EU and also in some Canadian jurisdictions. As it stands today, this is an amendment that has been proposed by the Greens as to the remaining passage of what's called the closing loopholes legislation. There's quite a bit of a rub, I suppose, as to what regulated working hours are for many people who work in a post-pandemic world where there is technology available and flexibility from both workers and bosses to do their work outside traditional business hours and outside traditional office spaces.
I think a lot of people listening to this would have had the experience of either working a lot of overtime that they're not necessarily paid for, but feeling that that's necessary for them to achieve what they want to achieve, but also this new, more flexible working hours arrangement that a lot of people have since COVID.
Yeah, absolutely. And therein lies the tension, doesn't it? As it stands today, there are laws in place which say that if you work additional hours than then overtime, you ought to get paid for that. And that depends on the nature of the work that you perform. So if you're an hourly paid worker and you're regulated by an award or an enterprise agreement, that instrument is likely to provide payment for working those overtime hours. And if you're a worker who's paid a salary, that salary is set based on an expectation or a requirement that you work certain additional hours. So as it stands, that is already the case. But, as you said, sometimes that drive or that motivation to work additional hours comes from the worker to do a good job or to set themselves up for the next promotion or because they love their job. So it's going to be a really potentially tricky one to navigate, particularly in this modern world where the traditional, clock in and clock out at 9 or 5 doesn't exist in many modern workplaces.
Is the right to disconnect a good idea?
Well, look, I join the echoes of the business community who've expressed concern in relation to these proposed amendments. But one, there's a question of enforceability, but more so the concern from the business community is that it actually might move us back to quite rigid and antiquated, archaic ways of working where they're strict. You clock on at this time and you clock off a certain other time, and that in a perverse way actually disincentivises workers and all the advances that have been made for flexible working, particularly people with caring responsibilities and the like.
Is it a bit ironic that I'm a journalist and you're a lawyer and we're talking about the problem of unpaid overtime, or at least of overtime and having to do work outside of work hours? Like, what's your experience of this issue?
Well, look, what this proposed amendment is really designed to get at is making sure that people don't burn out. It's less, as I understand it, about regulating the pay for those workers. As I said, we've already got a very robust suite of laws which provide those protections, and rightfully so, in my view, an increased focus on making sure that people don't burn out. So making sure that the design of job is appropriate, that it can be done within reasonable working hours, that there's protections in place, and that there's conversations between bosses and workers about workloads and timeframes and the like.
Natalie Gaspar there. Green Senator Barbara Pocock has been pushing for a right to disconnect for years, and she's the author of a book on work-life balance in Australia. Barbara, thanks for joining us. You're a senator, so is it going to be practical in your own life to disconnect?
Well, I'm a senator, which means I'm not a worker in the conventional employment relationship sense. I'm certainly working hard, but for example, to a nurse who does certain shifts, is paid for those shifts, and is not expected to work on the weekend in her employment contract, but in fact is rung every Sunday 7 times and asked whether she'll be available for a shift, or can she sort out how to fix a problem on the ward, which occurred yesterday when she was working.
I certainly take your point about the example with a nurse constantly being contacted. But what about young workers who are being ambitious for themselves? I'm sure that there are people who are listening to this who would have had the experience of being early on in their career and deciding for themselves, I'm going to do more work that I'm technically being paid for, but I'm accepting that because I want to do well in this career.
This right to disconnect that we're proposing won't prevent people from doing what they choose to do of their own free will. And people, of course, I've interviewed a lot of workers who love what they do and they want to do more of it. They like to do long hours, and it's a lot more fun, they say, doing that than being with their 4-year-old. There's a lot of people who love their job. There are also a lot of young people who are very insecure in their jobs, and they feel they can't say no to the boss. When there's a call that comes, or a text or an email that says, could you just help me out with this little thing? If you're not sure if your next contract is going to come to you, or you're casual, or there's 47 people who really want your job, then you haven't got the backing that you need to set a reasonable boundary around your work, even if you love your job.
Is this a bit sort of blue sky, though? Is it really practical for someone in the employment situation that you described before, someone who's in a vulnerable situation, they're insecure in their job, they don't know what's coming next, for them to take their employer to some kind of tribunal about not ringing them on a Sunday?
Because I think for lots of people that's not very realistic. It is a really big deal to go to a Fair Work Commission and take your employer essentially to an industrial court. And people are reluctant to do it. Most people do it with the assistance of a union, for example. So I don't think it's going to be lots and lots of legal cases instantly by any means. But hopefully the Fair Work Commission, the conversations that a change in law create, the thought that you might be pulled into a court, the employees might have greater capacity to do that. What this will do is it won't put everyone into court who gets unfair phone calls. It will say where things have gone totally off the rails and it's demonstrated that an employer has done the wrong thing, then that's going to be where you'll see some action where it's really needed.
We've got a couple of questions from our listeners on our broadcast channel on Instagram. Jane asks, all good, but How do you change the mindset of a Gen X male workaholic, which sounds a bit like someone in her life is that? How do you change that mindset?
At the centre of many workplaces, this kind of archetypical worker who's endlessly available, who never gets sick or works through their illness, not responsible for the care of their mum, doesn't have children, and that becomes the benchmark for what a proper lawyer looks like or what a proper radio announcer looks like. And that's, there's lots of research about that saying it's an incredibly difficult model for anyone who's got care responsibilities, mothers, aged care, people caring for an aged parent. And what we need to do is dislodge that archetype and put at the core of our workplace a reasonable worker who over the life course is going to be looking after other people, is going to have illnesses themselves possibly. And you need to be able to have a life, have a family and a community and friends and recover.
And Kelsey asks, how will employees be protected if they do report their bosses? I don't think that it's going to exactly be reporting your boss, so to speak, but how would it work?
Well, the provision in the Fair Work Act that we have crafted says that there shouldn't be adverse action taken against a worker who begins that conversation in their workplace or takes it further into a Fair Work Commission claim. But, that's technical black letter law. We know the reality of politics in a workplace. Many casual workers, as soon as they even contest a shift arrangement, will never get called back for a shift. We can't overturn the power relations of a growing and large insecure workforce in the Australian labour market, but we can provide more support to give that voice, that conversation of that worker a bit more backup. And that's what a right to disconnect is really aimed at.
And lastly, you mentioned that this is coming up in Parliament today. What would the timeline on this look like in practice? When would this right potentially start for people?
So what we have allowed for in our amendment is for a 12-month period for small business to get used to what's proposed here. Plenty of them, it'll be nothing different to what they already do. And 6 months for businesses of more than 15 employees. The Fair Work Commission will develop guidelines to assist people to get their heads around it and get it sorted and understand what being reasonable looks like. Most of us know it. We'll know what looks, a fair deal and what doesn't.
Well, Senator Barbara Pocock, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
No worries, Bension. Great to talk to you.
That was Greens Senator Barbara Pocock. And that's all we have time for in today's afternoon briefing. Sasha and the team will be back with your morning briefing tomorrow, so check your feed from 6 a.m. And if you want to be part of the show and get an inside look into how we make this thing, search the Briefing Podcast on Instagram and join our broadcast channel. I'm Bension Siebert. Thanks for listening.